where to look. You run down to the library and find yourself a book. When you get there, you find the book you need, but you find a whole lot more. You find all the services that the library has in store. There are stories for the kids and films and videos for you. Periodicals and reference to help you do the things that you want to do. There's music and there's art and there's literature for free. And best of all, smiling, friendly faces that you see. It's a people place, the library. Check it out at the library.
I want to begin by reading 5 poems called 5 Irish Pictures. The first is about a glass worker or a glass blower who is talking near the end of his life, and a very, very successful artist. The second is about swans swimming rather ignorantly, but also rather placidly on an Irish lake amid what the Irish call the Troubles between the Catholics and the Protestants and the Brits and the Irish. The third is about old men who live on the Aran Islands off the west coast of Ireland, where everything is rock, and they must build their houses out of rock. The fourth is about someone who is doing a rubbing, taking a piece of paper with graphite or a pencil and getting an impression off an ancient carving. And the last has to do with deer, a rather celebrated deer in Ireland called the white deer at Mallow. And the deer are really only a prelude to some supernatural deer that have long since been dead. After writing these 5 poems, I became aware that the common theme running through them was that people and things and places don't want to die. And so each of them strives for a kind of immortality in his own way or its own way. 5 Irish Pictures, The Glass Worker. For 40 years in such burned hands the passionate quarrel, the way his rigor held, then softened, spun into iridescences by line, tone, the elements of love. But near death, when the hard expression of himself in glass was not enough, he cradled the whiskey in his massive hands, saying, "I want pure." Something like a last blown breath absent of regret would do, he said, or a simple taking off in which my own small pulse might become the last circumference of myself. "I know I'm good," he said. But let's say in that moment between my death and fame, there might be something light-caught, pure, undreamed, even crystalline with good oblivion. Then the aware of the absurdity, he laughed. Barley Cove, West Cork. Across the blue-black water, something like a dozen swans. How can they be so calm? Ignorance is white feathers. As time ripples from them, we never see their black legs churn, nor the faint red sparks that snap and lapse between their nerves. We lack the innocence to call them on. In the rushes, old greens run. Over the hills, bigots suck marrow from each other's bones. Even the last down by the water, with the parts we used to die for, turns. Old men, Aran Islands. None of them choose their stone houses. The houses choose them. Rocks lifted one by one, fitted together in design, flint edges kissing each other in prehistoric recognition. And outside, wherever one looks, paved distance slates the eye. Inside, an inward breed of men still sit at tables, the air between their fingers dark and heavy, stones vaulting their lives. Once the sons of women now long gone, in churchyards they have bitten their mothers' names from stone. And from time to time, going down through the rundales of the walls, they have stopped among the gravestones, opening the strongholds of their hands. There they have touched words into a smoothness, words like Angela and Anne. Stone rubbing, Douth Passage grave. Slowly the lead begins, falling like gray rain across an ancient rose, then moving up, a slate aspiration climbing as the pencil climbs. This grave slab squat, squared by a hand, its fingers blunt, its cramped flesh thickened by the chiseling hours. Was he hunched by trade, ragged of youth? Was he too measured by the rain's soft teeth? On this stone, old evidence of art, a primitive rose, the hard unfolding of a Neolithic dream, and my rubbing mocks his work. In this churchyard, filled with shadows etched with sound, the white shoes of this tourist simply glare and bloom. The white deer of Mallow. Then there was one stag running, the soft Irish air on its shoulders, its great lungs red with memory's blood, and I remembered what I was told as a child, how the lives of some things went out to the edge of the world, to places where ghosts filtered from the mists, great pagan movings with their ears flared, their pale heads cocked. And these race-feeling running things fist and relax, had wind again in their faces, the trees leaning in, until a jerk or start would fall over this bone horde. And there at the edge of the world, remembering hard in the plenty of time, they would suddenly find themselves running, the red seal and signature once again in their eyes. Now I want to switch to something very, very different. I've just completed a manuscript of bird poems. And as some of you know, I've had a lifelong fascination with birds. I breed and raise homing pigeons and fly them. This manuscript is called A Brief History of Feathers, and it's about all kinds of birds. And the poems are written in different styles, with different tones, very, very different voices. They're not as various as the species of birds, obviously, but they're still various enough. So I'm going to begin by reading the first poem in the manuscript, which is obviously an ecological poem. It simply imagines a time in which there are no birds. All the birds have been killed off, the way the passenger pigeon has been killed and the dodo. So this poem is simply called The Birds. No one could halt the acid rain. Month after month it fell, never looking like lethal distillations, until late one evening as the gray sky began to cool, the air, which had made a polluted covenant with silence, rumbled, and the rain came down in choking sheets. The green of the trees had long since been caressed by fatal tears, cankered the way beauty always is by the politics of the self-serving, and no birds flew. though we remember them hanging on to branches, dark among the bark's sepulchral scale. But when they dropped, petals with intestinal troubles, eaten from the inside out, how light they were among the moldering leaves. There was really nothing for the white mouths of the worms to deadly feed on. Still, we have pictures of the birds, and young children occasionally draw them without stimulus. Reaching back into the now graying history of their tribe, they sketch something flying out of their eyes over their cement houses, as if flight were more than a brood with metal wings, as if there were a wilderness in which birds sang. And the second poem is called The Swift. This is a bird that the bird people call the flying cigar. I mean, you look out in the backyard in summer evenings and you see this little thing flying up there. It looks like a cigar with two wings. Looks as if it has no feathers on it. And it's just inexhaustible. It just keeps flying and flying and flying. Sometimes, if you're fortunate enough and you're a real bird enthusiast, you can see a swift helicopter down the chimney. Have you seen these? They just hover over the chimney and they just lower themselves. So they make nests like swallows do in barns, but then they make nests inside chimneys. And now, because everybody is so interested in energy conservation and putting caps on chimneys, there are fewer and fewer chimneys to nest in for the swifts. What I try to do in this poem is let the swift be a swift as long as I can let the swift be a swift. Everyone who writes poetry knows that you get going with a description, and sometimes the description works out something in the process which is greater than the simple description. So for a long time in the poem, I just want to talk about the swift's characteristics until death comes in, and then the poem assumes a different dimension, and a hopefully climactic one. The swift. I think in his childhood my father believed in swifts. He never said much, but there must have been that rock of hard truth in their lives, that phenomenal gospel called flight. And featherless, I think he too came to feel the inordinate mystery of air, the transubstantiation of wind into fingers and arms, what it was to be born. And nothing proved this more than the flight of the swift. Here was a thing which looked featherless, beating the air. Darting from chimneys, the swifts became his quickening and gliding of evening, his sky gone wild with chevrons. And no god had more inexhaustible angels. Only when drinking would they dip down, each snipping the water in turn, their song a clicking series of notes, bird code. And every evening they would return, laced with speed and good blood. Then he found one dead in the yard, a substance having gone out of the bird, only an accident remaining. As he held it, its wings outstretched in his palm, it was so light it could barely be felt. I think my father tried to fit life back into that bird. I think he tried hard. But there are some things he never said, like the first time he fingered death, which must have had very long wings and very small feet. And one of the things I set out to do in writing these poems, I was very, very conscious of it, was that I simply wanted the bird to be a bird. I didn't want to use birds unless I had to, unless it was irresistible. I just wanted to describe birds as if they were such unique things, such special things in a species sense, that they could justify themselves. So here's something called a common grackle. These are these black birds that the males have the V tails, walk across your yard, you know, and the iridescence is purple and green, really remarkable. Common grackle. It was just a common blackbird walking across the lawn until it began flashing on and off its green and purple necklaces, which caused me to pull down my sight. Here were two pearl eyes riveted with dark pupils, atoms in a mercurial swim. Then it flew off, its V'd tail a trailing ensign of victory, a salute to the morning's platinum light. And I wondered, where was it going? And how could the air open up so easily like an envelope taking it in? In fact, the sky said, "Here is your light blue reception. Here are salons draped with spun cirrus, ambassadorial nimbus." But the bird flew on, breasting a common itinerant wind, a feathered shadow, a flying period, signing itself with invisible ink. Something triggered this poem, which made the poem then write itself. I just more or less sat back, and the poem went from the beginning right down to the bottom. What triggered the poem was my realization that having adopted two boys, one who is half black and half Indian, and the other who is half black and half white, there would conceivably come a time in which someone would walk up to them on the streets of Kearney and simply say, "It's your time right now." And they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. I mean, they wouldn't be able to run. They would simply have to stand there, caught as the hawk was caught in the trap, and tell themselves basically who they were by either taking the beating that was about to ensue or by beating somebody else up. So this is called The Hawk, and it's about something which is so hopelessly trapped. The only way it can be victorious is by turning defeat into victory, by refusing to be defeated. Somewhere years from now, I hope I'm saying this to my sons. Why the hawk had hit the trap, I couldn't guess. In the face of it, it was pointless. But it had hit the trigger dead center with both feet, for a moment lifting that fatal weight before the blind torque of the trap had sprung. After that, its wings had clawed at the sand for hours. Its cries had gradually sunk back into its throat, although its beak thrust defiantly at the stream held on to its animal yellow. Then it had pulled everything in. For a moment, the hawk, and only the hawk's turn, in that blind and beautiful light, trying to hold on, as the trap held on, to what it was. Barn owls have startling faces. I mean, here's an owl that looks right straight at you with both eyes coming this way, and it has this great mask on it, white and things like that. Very, very mystical face. We had one of these in the hayloft of my grandmother's barn. And inevitably, if we were out at the right time, here came this barn owl flying through the hayloft door and off into the evening. I suppose you know that I was, 12, 13 years old, somewhere around there, when I saw this owl for the first time. And it's haunted me ever since then. So I'm not really sure what this next poem means, although it has a little farm in here. My mother used to stand on the back steps of the farm house and call us in every night when it was after dark. The owl would fly out of the hayloft door and disappear into the dusk. All of those things are worked into this, but I'm not sure what the end of this poem means. And I'm really not, I am certain that I don't want to know. Barn owl. You want me to know? I don't want to know. Barn owl. High in the rafters of the barn, against the opening where the ropeless pulley hung, something the bird people call Tito Alba, and what we saw as the mother of the white mask suddenly set sail. There was no sound, only the onyx eyes, the rich tones of its back and chocolate skull cap, and of course that face of white. And in that moment when we lost our sight, that is, when our eyes went out of us, following that bird as if it were a long, soft nerve into the evening, no one stirred. And through the hayloft door we heard our mother's territorial voice calling us from the back steps of the house, as if that owl could speak, as if in our childlike world something beyond the dark, deep, deep into the night, could call us into sleep. There's a section of this book devoted to rare birds, really made-up stories about birds. There's a poem about the Archaeopteryx, the first bird. Once I got going on these things, it was like a bird drunk. I just couldn't give up on what was going on. And then I'll read you a poem that it was recommended that I write. I'm not sure that it came out well, but that was one of those things. But here's what the ostrich was supposed to be. Most of the time, it is content to be what it is. Most of the time it is content to be what it is, passing its days by pointing its long, slim neck toward indeterminate meaning. Grotesque, almost having no head, it walks partially naked through the world. For it, flight is a truncated memory. Still, there are times when it remembers what it was supposed to be. A small bird with a silver head and a human face nesting in an immortal tree. Now, if you're ugly, wouldn't you want to be something like that? I frequently have. Let's go all the way to China. This poem takes place in the dynasty of some ancient emperor. A guy who believes that art is an improvement upon life. And what he's asked his artisans to do is to take a live bird and simply encase it in glass. But in so doing, to avoid destroying any of the iridescence the bird has. Seems to me to be a believable thing that someone who is extremely dynastic might do. The other thing I must probably say is that, you remember when they opened some of those tombs of the ancient Chinese emperors and found all those terracotta soldiers, thousands and thousands with the horses to go with them? Well, that's in here too. So this is called the glass bird. Stuck in that man-made ice, the crystal bird was a mask. Even its eyelids, forever frozen in sight, had been caught in a beautiful moment. It was a remarkable feat, the emperor's artisans wrapping a wild bird in glass without burning its rare iridescence. The emperor himself was dead. Before his artisans could finish their task, he slept underground with 1,000 clay warriors cast in funereal gloom, his eyes darkly pitched. But as the day slowly warmed, outside his old windows, a bird of free beauty, perched in a redbud, was turning liquid with song. Take that, Emperor. Right? Yeah. I just finished that when one of my colleagues in the philosophy department came in, and he said, "You must write about the bird of free beauty." And I said, "I know birds, but I don't think I've ever heard of the bird of free beauty. Where is this?" "Oh," he said, "that's in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason." And I said, "Nah, I'm not interested in doing this." He said, "I've got the idea planted already. I can see it." He did. So I don't know much about Kant, I didn't know much about Kant then, and I didn't do any reading of Kant. But what I remembered from reading Kant and not understanding him was that Kant's whole idea was about intuition. We have these things that just come to us like that. So I thought, why not? We'll try Kant's Bird of Free Beauty. Hatched from nothing. It came forth without a syntactical spine, a racial memory, this bird of free beauty. Slightly more than illusion, but less than thought. It was all wing. Free, it flew without yearning, enfleshed intuition. Its song was the arc of a note on a tongue just before it could sing. Its love was the essence of nothing. Its beauty, the whole of its hollowness. Its luminless body, a lean. Kant and I are going to get together someday, and I'm going to find out how close I came to understanding him. And I don't think he'll be particularly pleased, but I'm not sure. If this manuscript has any title poem, it's this one called The History of Feathers. I know where this poem came from. At least I know where the poem started from. My father told me that in about 1914, when he was 11 years old, he was walking a field northwest of a farmhouse in Custer County when a bird got up that just absolutely amazed him. He shot it. Then he decided that he better not take the bird home because his father had told him that there were birds like this that had been introduced to Nebraska. And he said, "For God's sake, don't you shoot any of them." So then he was in a real fix. He wanted to show some people that he had shot this bird, which had a coloration such as he had never ever dreamed of. But he couldn't take it home and show it to his father, who was an avid hunter. So he went to the neighbors and sought out the neighbor boy, he said, showed him the bird. Then the two of them skinned it, gave it to the neighbor boy's mother to cook for supper, and he went home. It was a pheasant. It was a cock pheasant. So in 1913, 1914, cock pheasants had made their way from somewhere, wherever they introduced them or stalked them, into the Broken Bow area. And that's the way this poem got started. But this poem reads more like a parable. It's a parable of a man who is trying to convince other people that some things should exist only for beauty's sake. You don't have to kill them. They don't have to exist for sport's sake. You don't have to eat them. They don't have to exist for food's sake. All they have to do is be what Emerson once said: beauty is its own excuse for being. So he's trying to tell some people this. Maybe some Nebraskans, and Kansas, and South Dakotans. A history of feathers. As for the pheasants, when he brought them and released them in the new land, the land was drab. And he told them the pheasants took their brilliant colors from the streams which ran beside their old nesting places, and no one believed him. So he drew word pictures of green and scarlet water, a water arching up into violets and purples and the softest mauves, as if spirit itself could play around a nesting place. And when still no one believed him, he said, "Let me tell you a story about the history of feathers." And he told them of something rising out of a blood-gray pith, of its struggling upward to become vein and shaft, then wrung out into a climax of color. But because it was a drab land and cold, they asked what color of meat these pheasants had. He said white. And slobbering over the thought of white meat, they laughed out loud, saying they were no fools, that there was nothing to this history of feathers. Here's another poem about another individual who has no more luck keeping birds alive. People know what starlings are? You know what starlings are? Most people consider starlings to be a nuisance. And yet, if you're ever lucky enough to have a bird feeder and then have snow on the ground in the wintertime and have those starlings come with their winter plumage and see them as they are iridescently appareled, you'll never forget what a starling is. There is a bronze color to starlings, a metallic bronze color, which I've seen only duplicated in a certain kind of pigeons called archangels. But they have been bred, selectively bred for that. Starlings, to my knowledge, have never been selectively bred. They've just happened in nature. Anyway, this is a story, my made-up story about getting starlings from England into this country. Apparently they got in on a boat or something and then took over. But this boy is going to bring these starlings over when he comes as an immigrant. It's called A Boy's Starlings. Emigrating from the old country, the birds came in a willow cage tended by a small Welch boy who sang to them the ancient language of tree bards, ringing odes, notes lustrous enough to coat the birds in volumes of bronze. In steerage, the ship's black hold, he kept his face to their cage for 40 days through swells and in leakage, trying to keep their plumage alive. Rare pulses of green, sotto voces of blue, penumbras of violet. But at the end, the birds dead, he debarked in New England. Green, green were the tongues of the trees to which he sang the dead starling song, which was a strange and haunting disquiet. One of the reasons I wrote about birds was because they're about as tough as they are beautiful. And because when they work at their work, they sing when they're doing it. So the next to the last poem I'm going to read is about orioles that make fantastically intricate nests. And maybe the nests are somewhat like the poems that some of us write. Hopefully well made, intricate, functional in their own way. The Baltimore Oriole. This morning the oriole is a good carpenter, working himself for the sake of its nest. Hounding the right bits of grass, it has turned flight into a muscular blossoming. The air is something it keeps slipping into. It is what it beats into breath with its life. Tonight the sky will be hung with migrational stars. It will be the dark hunting ground of owls, the briefer tomb of anything sleeping. But tomorrow the oriole will be at its work again, and it will be singing. And the last poem, and also the last poem in the manuscript, is entitled "The Man Who Loved Birds." All his life birds rose from strange fields like landscapes bursting their vessels. He never had to ask who they were. Some things never knock when they enter. They drop like minutes into the middle of summer, or come up like the best vowels along the edges of our tongues. And for him, it was like this with birds. For as long as he remembered, they had flown lightly out of the dark, like children's hands turned loose in the wind, each one of them flying ahead of him with the grace of a palm, dipping and turning, beating and soaring, in love with that circumstance called air.